Hello, all you textual deviants, and welcome to episode 42 of Texting. I'm Tomek in St. Petersburg.
And I'm Mark Will in Taipei. What's on the agenda today?
Today, Mark, we're going to be discussing Oscar Wilde's seminal text, De Profundis. Is that how you pronounce that? Profundis?
Sounds okay to me. Means from the depths. From the depths.
Yeah, this is a text that snuck up on me.
This is not his title, by the way, but Robbie Ross, the editor of the first edition, chose it.
Okay.
We'll get into that later, I assume. But
sure.
Yes, tell us why did you pick this? You say this text snuck up on you. How so? Give us the background.
Sure. So it was the winter break. I was visiting my wife's family in Bashkortostan, and I'm old school,
like
so
we
I'm
know
always...
where that is.
Don't worry about it. And I'm old school, so I always still read paper. Doesn't matter what. I'll read paper over reading the thing I want to read digitally. So paper is like a restricting factor for me, and I don't really mind because there's always good stuff that I haven't read. So visited several bookstores in Ufa. Obviously selection was limited, but I came across this text, and it cost 219 rubles, which is about $2. So that was kind of cool. Couple minor typos, and interestingly, I can't find even one text online that 100% matches this, which is quite odd. I know that this particular text has different editions floating out there depending on editor choices, but it is kind of funny to me that I'm reading a text that I couldn't share with you, for instance. Like, it would just be impossible. I think maybe on some Chinese website I found a similar version.
Well,
Did you want to say? Yeah.
I think the reason for that is, because the first edition, edited by Wilde's friend and former lover Robbie Ross, excised all references to Boosey's family, right? So the version I found, the abridged version, begins with the section on suffering and the value of suffering to the artist and to the person in the development of the personality. So I didn't even, and I think that's what I had read before. I think I had read an abridged version or excerpts thereof. But, this is a letter. It is a letter addressed to Lord Alfred Douglas, pictured here with Oscar. Dear Boosey. And then it begins with a rather long denunciation of the addressee and his family. So all references to that personal stuff were cut, I guess, for fear of a libel lawsuit by Robbie Ross, who also, as I say, titled it. I mean, really,
Right.
It's a letter. It's a letter from, Oscar Wilde to his estranged boyfriend, Lord Alfred Douglas, a.k.a. Boosey.
Although I think it's worth adding that it's a letter that Oscar Wilde clearly knew was a work of art, and immediately upon release from prison, he wanted it copied, and so it's very self-aware in that sense of it being a framework for this huge treatise. Yeah.
Yes,
but
it's an open letter with many, rhetorical purposes. He's venting.
He denies
he's
those.
Attacking. Yeah, but the lady doth protest too much, methinks, uh, as we discussed in texts before recording, right? Like you can see that despite all of his protestations to the contrary, he is both attacking Boosey and defending himself. Rightly so, perhaps, but you know, sometimes it's it doesn't. As a reader, I didn't think it was like entirely sincere, which is fine. Maybe
It's
that
a
adds to the
crazy.
interest of the text.
It's like an ecstatic rant. I mean, it's an impressive text in the sense that his inner reflections of a very intelligent man with a lot of emotion, a lot of sensitivity, and I think we get access to a side of him that I don't know, because I don't consider myself like a Wildean or someone who is particularly proficient in his catalog, his oeuvre. But regardless, I doubt that there's anything else in his bibliography which compares. It's very intimate. I really felt I was constantly kind of getting high as I was reading this because I did really feel like he was speaking to me, and yeah, the that kind of closeness between the reader and the writer, I felt was very powerful. I was really entranced and embedded in my reading. I don't know about you.
Well, I mean, I have an edition of his plays over here uh, on my bookshelf, so I think I've read all of the plays. I read Dorian Gray, all of which was in preparation for the second volume of the Aaronesque series of novelettes that I'm working on with my co-author G.J. Villa. And here's volume one, people. It's called Flansday. Every volume focuses on a different Irish writer. Volume one is Flann O'Brien. Volume two is Oscar Wilde, and it will be called Wilde's Day. So I'm actually glad you chose this because this project has been lying dormant for a while, and I, was inspired to go back and take another look at it. And I've determined, like, during my break, I'm going to finish editing Wilde's Day and prepare that for publication. So,
Would you agree though that this particular text has that kind of immediacy and
well,
intimacy?
but there's an essay called "The Soul of Man Under Socialism," which,
I've seen that.
um,
Haven't read it,
yeah,
but yeah.
I'm not sure about the chronology of that though. But a lot of the Christian or Christ inspired um, concepts that we encounter in De Profundis are also present in that essay. It would be, I should have looked that up, right? Like, was that written before prison or after? I think it must have been before, because after De Profundis, there was
Very
only the
little came
Ballad
out.
of
You're right. Exactly.
Reading Jail, and then he was dead. So I think he was already maybe considering these ideas, but which is a kind of a common theme, right? Think about like Malcolm X and his time in prison, how he converts to Islam. Think about all the other born again prisoners, that come out um,
Dostoevsky.
babbling about Jesus. Well, yeah,
Or producing
actually
great work.
Dostoevsky's. Yeah, I mean Dostoevsky's House of the Dead, which I read a few years ago, was very much in my mind as I read this as well.
But you still didn't really like
So,
address my main point here, which
oh,
was, well, I'm just saying I wanted to know, it was a question. Did you feel that what stands out, what impresses most about this specific text is, as I'm saying, this kind of diary like quality, the raw emotion.
Yeah, but see, I don't necessarily agree with that because
That's
as
fine.
I
It's fine. But I
said,
just want you
there
to
no,
speak to it.
let me explain why. It's because I think there are multiple rhetorical purposes at play here. On the one hand, there's this newfound sincerity, right? Like this desire to strip the mask off and to be exactly or let's say completely oneself, right? Most people are other people, he says, and that's not like a good thing. He wants to be completely himself. But
And he argues about
my
sorrow
point
and how sorrow reveals like your true nature. But we'll get into that
but
later.
but my point is I think that too could be interpreted as a kind of pose, and sincerity itself can be a mask. We talked about this in the episode on Bowie, and it may have come up at other times too. But you know what I'm
Okay,
saying, right?
I'm not arguing. I'm not arguing that this we should take as the authentic self or something. I'm just saying in the tone, whether it's him or not, whether it's rhetorical or not. I'm
Right.
just saying in terms of the ease of reading, or you don't have like the distance that you would get in the artifice necessary to create a story through, you're creating characters, you've got settings, you've got plot devices. But here it's like he is speaking just without these kind of constrictions, with rhetoric, no doubt. But I don't know, I just felt, like I'm really I really felt a closeness, whether it was to a character or whether it was, it doesn't really matter. But just in terms of the way it reads,
Yeah,
will you
I
grant me
mean,
that?
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's not like the language of Salome, which is very artificial, and written for
And it
the
was
stage, of
surprisingly
course,
easy
because
to
it's a
read, I
play.
would say. Like it didn't it it had a nice vocabulary, but
It's
it didn't feel. Yeah,
conversational at
right.
times. Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. I just would caution against, you know, the assumption that because it's conversational and free flowing and, you know, there's a personal quality, intimate quality about it that, this is somehow the authentic Oscar Wilde or Oscar Wilde finally unmasked.
Sure, sure. I mean,
I would just say that, the claim that removing the mask is the ideal, that in itself can be a kind of donning of a new mask. That's all I would say. And
and I
I'm
think
not making a judgment on that. I'm not saying it's good or it's bad. I just felt that at times, though I also found parts of it very moving, very true, um,
and I just wanted to add,
profound, if I can use that word.
I think it also reveals like how scattered he is as a person. Um he contradicts himself a lot. He shows so many different faces. So even if you were looking for some kind of authentic maskless Wilde, I mean, I don't, he, especially in the more modern or postmodern context, that doesn't really exist. I mean, he is a multifaceted, contradictory person who hasn't, as he himself states at one point, I think, anyone who's kind of figured themselves out, like, doesn't have much depth to their character. So, like, to know yourself, only the people who are shallow know themselves.
Well,
Can we keep moving with the
I
slides,
mean,
or we go on?
sure. I was just going to say, I mean, whatever you think of it, I think you have to admit it's an amazing achievement. I mean, the unabridged version, I think, is 50,000 words. And I listened to a reading of it because, number one, I couldn't find the unabridged text on short notice. Um, it was 6 hours read by Neil Bartlett, I believe his name is. That's on YouTube. I'll include a link. Um, I would listen to 30 minutes at a time. And so I listened to the entire thing. Then I went back and read an abridged version, which is, less than half that length. But as I was listening to the 6 hour oral version, the audiobook version, as it were, I mean, I was just amazed. This is a 50,000 word letter, that he wrote in prison under the worst of circumstances, despite
Yeah.
not only the sorrow and despair he's feeling, but also ill health, um, you know, personal tragedy. His mom died. His wife decided that he couldn't see the kids. He perhaps still longs for Boosey despite all his personal attacks.
Oh, he certainly does.
Uh,
Yeah.
so just the achievement, and also he discusses this, like the humiliation and shame um, that he endured, just the fact that he picked himself up and determined to keep producing art, right? Like, this is not a drawing room comedy that's going to be a hit on the London stage, and
And
yet
that's
he
why,
still. Mm-hmm.
yeah, I was just gonna say, that's why it's also a shame that he did end up publishing so little, because he was obviously, he had the capacity to produce this in the circumstances you're describing. I mean, I know that the kind of zest for life, the joie de vivre, had been knocked out of him, and that's completely understandable. But you wonder if he'd had a little bit more support, both financially and emotionally, after being released from prison. I mean, he did receive some, but if he had been a bit more stable, he likely could have produced more. Uh, but anyway, I think we should keep moving unless you have something pressing.
Yeah, carry on.
Okay, so why don't you tell us about this secondary or primary title? And I'll
Well,
explain the picture on the right.
it says Epistola in carcere et vinculis, which literally means in Latin epistle or letter in jail and chains. So is that like an alternative title? This is the first I'm hearing of it.
I mean, I thought you told me that Robbie came up with the De Profundis.
Yes,
So I
but
think this was Wilde's.
that's a different Latin phrase.
Right, I
This is
know,
just
but
a generic term.
well, I think this was the original title. I mean, we can go back and verify all this, but this is definitely either an alternate title uh or an addendum. But either way, I found this quite interesting. Just this JPEG that I found, which is the Russian version of this text. You can see here at the bottom, Leningrad, 1924, which is pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then it says, it says De Profundis here, and up here it says v Tyrmie I Cielach Poslania. I know if Tyrmia means in from the prison.
Mm-hmm.
And so this part must mean that in chains, right? So
Yeah.
anyway, it's pretty cool.
Well,
Okay,
what's the date on that? 1919,
24.
right?
Yeah, and that's interesting too. I mean, I guess that was during the time when, it wasn't, there was still maybe that excitement about initial socialism, so the censors hadn't cracked down too much. In the beginning for artists it wasn't bad. Maybe that's why this got pressed so quickly. I don't know. I'd have to look at that, but it is interesting that date. That someone has
Well,
decided
this
it's
is
urgent that the Russian people get some Oscar Wildes.
well, this is 24 years after his death, right? He dies
That's right.
1900.
That's right.
And just to, give listeners an idea of how close he is to us in time, he dies in 1900. That's the year that Hemingway was born. I
Yeah,
mean, isn't that fascinating? Hemingway, who would be like on the cover of Life magazine just sometime in the 50s. So it's just very, we think of him as, I don't know, a Victorian, even though we associate him with the fin de siècle, but it's really not that far removed from us
sure,
in
sure.
time, you know?
Agreed, agreed. Okay, uh,
I mean, 1924, uh, that's literally 100 years ago.
yeah. Well, he's he was born in the modern era. That's for certain. Okay, some basic things that we hope to address. Um, Mark and I know that we do have the tendency to babble and to sidetrack a little bit, so we'll do our best to be disciplined. But we've got kind of 5 sections, 5 chapters that this pod hopes to address. The first chapter will provide people with basic context to De Profundis and to the major characters in Oscar Wilde's life. Then we'll go into a bit more detail about Oscar's love affair with Lord Alfred Douglas, or Boosey. Then we will talk about the incidents that led to Oscar being imprisoned. I don't know if I should call him Oscar or Mr. Wilde. Then we will
Saint
discuss
Oscar.
St. Oscar's time in the jowls of jowl. How do you say the second one? Gowl?
Jail.
Oh, you just say it jail.
It's
That's just an old
jail.
spelling?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, the jowls of jail. And finally, we will spend an undetermined amount of time discussing Oscar Wilde's interpretations of Christ and relationship to Jesus, which I personally found very accessible, fun, and fascinating. So, without further ado, we'll get into the context. Uh, some very basic info about De Profundis. We've already talked about a lot, I think, in our initial chat. But as Mark explained earlier, it was written by Oscar Wilde during his imprisonment in Reading Jail to Lord Alfred Douglas, or Boosey. In its first half, this is from Wikipedia, Wilde recounts their previous relationship and extravagant lifestyle, which eventually led to Wilde's conviction and imprisonment for gross indecency. He indicts both Lord Alfred's vanity and his own weakness in acceding to these wishes. In the second half, Wilde charts his spiritual development in prison and identification with Jesus Christ, whom he characterizes as a romantic individual artist. And as Mark said earlier, the letter begins, "Dear Boosey," and ends, "Your affectionate friend." Oscar Wilde is best known for The Picture of Dorian Gray, several hugely successful plays that were published in the 1890s, including The Importance of Being Earnest. He's also very well known for his epigrams. Lord Alfred Douglas, also known as Boosey Douglas, born 1870, and Wilde was born in 1854, so Wilde would have been 16 years his senior. He was Oscar Wilde's lover, although I think quickly became more like best friend because they both kind of tired of each other as sexual partners and would instead go out to the London prostitute bars, is a better word, brothels, and feast on young boys. We'll get into that.
Sometimes very young, I read, like, you know, underage by today's standards.
Sure, absolutely. And yeah, maybe just to help people understand who this guy was. I mean, he was a noble, right? He had a title. His father was the Marquis. Is that how you pronounce that? Marquis
Mm-hmm.
of Queensberry, and we'll talk about him in a second. do you want to say anything just to maybe help the reader imagine this human?
Well, I would say watch the film version from the 90s with Stephen Fry as Oscar Wilde, Jude Law as Boosey, Tom Wilkinson plays the father very convincingly.
And I think who Michael Sheen
Um,
was Robbie.
Michael Sheen is Robbie Ross. He's also good
He
in
was very
that.
good.
Um, yeah, I thought that was well done. I've been meaning to watch that for some time, but I've never been able to obtain a copy. So, thank you to the Russian video pirates, uh, and thanks to you for
Yeah.
sharing it. It's
Sorry
quite
about the delays with that. Yeah.
well done. It's quite well done. I mean,
And I
Stephen
want you to
Fry
watch this
is
other one, this
perfectly cast.
Rupert Everett film as well, The Happy Prince
Okay, I
from
don't know about that.
2018.
All
Yeah, I
right,
think in many ways it's more artful.
he plays Wilde, Rupert Everett.
Yeah, and he's like a massive fan of Wilde's. So he's there. You can find lots of recitations, and I think he just saw him as a major inspiration on his own career and like as a gay icon, somebody he looked up to.
Hmm.
So just briefly, I would say I would have liked to almost hear Boosey's defense, or because so much of this text is Wilde serving up vitriol and making Boosey seem like just the most superficial, catty, temper
Selfish.
tantrum. Yeah, I mean, just and just dunking on him over and over and over again, just reducing him to nothing. So it would have been curious to hear the other perspective and just because ultimately, like, you are a man, like you could have. He does claim that he tried to leave him many times, but he could have left him. I mean, you're in the relationship. It takes two to tango, kind of thing, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I've had that thought many times while reading it. And then, of course, after he gets out of prison, despite all this, he lives with him for another 3 months,
Right, right.
So it's
So yeah, it would have
and
been
like all of those excuses, like, oh well, the only reason I took you back is because your mom begged me to, and I didn't want to cause disruptions in your family life or whatever, and it was you who tricked me into suing your father, and come on, like, be a big boy and
exactly.
admit that you chose to do all this. But
And if
I would
someone's
just say
putting
about,
other people down, go on.
well, I was just gonna say, like, Boosey's later life. By the way, I this is a random trivial
No
detail, but
worries.
the loathsome Douglas Murray wrote a biography of
I
Boosey. Did
saw
you know
that
that?
just like
Yeah,
2 hours ago, which is
it's like
the two are a
one
match.
one Douglas writing about another. But
I cannot
anyhow,
stand that guy.
yeah. Well, I mean,
There are a few
I
media figures that I find more abhorrent.
well, especially now, I was impressed by his debating skills when he teamed up with Matt Taibbi at that Canadian um, debate event. It was Matt Taibbi and Douglas Murray versus Malcolm Gladwell and some New York Times hack. You know,
I've always been impressed by his rhetorical ability.
yeah. But I mean, he's just a shameless propagandist. He's proven himself to be that in
And
of
so
late.
self-righteous.
Yeah, with this is Israel,
Oh my god, his
Gaza
coverage is
conflict. It's
disgusting.
it's it's repulsive. But anyway, I just wanted to say, like, in later life, Boosey became an anti-Semite, fascist of sorts.
Catholic.
Uh, Yeah, then like well, I guess Wilde is moving in that direction too towards the end of his life. But yeah,
I'm not even
um,
sure Catholic, but he becomes like super religious. He might have been,
yeah,
but then he shapeshifts again because I mean he'll go through periods where he like completely dismisses Wilde and judges him, but then later on in his life he mellows again and starts to. I mean, you could say that he's maybe taking advantage of Wilde's name at that point, but either way, I'm just
absolutely,
saying
yeah.
he does
Didn't he publish a
soften
book
that.
called My Life with Oscar Wilde or something like that?
Exactly, yeah. So you know, I don't know,
So
but
yeah,
yeah,
how seriously can we take either of these two lovers? I mean, it's like he said, right? Like
it is that. I guess
it's
I
a
would just
lover's
say
quarrel.
it. We don't have great defenses of Boosey that we know of. Like, it's clear that he didn't get along with his dad. I don't think Oscar Wilde is lying when he talks about his mom pointing out all these character defects. We know Robbie despised him. I mean, it does seem like. I mean, I'm giving Wilde the benefit of the doubt on this. He does seem like this dude was, adult. I don't know if that's the right word, but yeah. I mean, he probably wasn't great, but yeah, I would have liked to. Even if he had I would just like to have seen even his like sarcastic response to this book, like, oh fucking Oscar being a little bitch, like whatever it would be. It's at
Well,
least that would give some degree of
he refused to read it. Apparently, he burned it.
okay.
That's
That's yeah,
that's
that's
that's what I saw. Like,
yeah,
and I
because
think he
Oscar
didn't
Wilde was
even
always like,
know.
you must read this. You have to repent.
I don't. I don't know that that he even realized it was addressed to him. Like a copy was handed to him, and he just threw it on the fire.
Fucking
That's
Oscar
that's
again.
that's something I encountered. I don't know if it's reliable, but I did see that, and it would seem to be keeping with his character. But
Yeah.
as far as like authorities on the subject, Richard Ellman is generally thought to have written the definitive biography of Wilde, and my co-author um, read GJV read the that massive tome, the entire biography of Wilde by Ellman, and he seems to think that horrific character, so he's on Team Wilde, and I guess I would have to say I am
But
too
again,
for the most
but
part.
Wilde loved him. You know, that's the
Yeah,
thing. After all, despite all
yeah,
the shit, that's all I'm saying. So, and he
right.
loved and even after prison, he would say like he would defend him when everybody was saying don't go live with him. He says you guys just don't know what it's like what our love is like. So,
Mm-hmm. He has no one else but me.
okay, so next up we have the arch villain, um, Boosey's father, which Wikipedia describes as a I read that as brutish, which would have made more sense. But brutish comes in the next line. Okay. A British nobleman of the Victorian era, remembered for his atheism. That's interesting with the Douglas Murray connection. His outspoken views, his brutish manner, for lending his name to the Queensberry rules that formed the basis of modern boxing, and for his role in the downfall of the Irish author and playwright Oscar Wilde. So, uh, we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of the case that he brings against Oscar Wilde later. And I'm going to keep going for the sake of time, if that's okay, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
We've got Robbie here. We've mentioned him. He was Oscar Wilde's staunchest friend, defender, kind of helped get Oscar back on his feet when he was released from prison. He loved Oscar, and it wasn't necessarily reciprocated to the same ardency, but I think Oscar refers to him a lot in De Profundis. often in almost a way to make Boosey jealous. Like he says,
A
"Oh well, Robbie does this. This
counterexample.
is
It's like
yeah."
exactly. Here's what a true friend. Here's how a true friend would behave. Here's how a loyal person acts.
But the thing is, if maybe you and I both know that, like, if you've got that girl who likes you and she's a great girl, but she's not the one that like lights your fire, it's like it's nice, but really you want the girl that you love or that you have a crush on to give you that attention, and it's never going to be as satisfying coming from that more like secondary figure. So I guess my only point there being that Bosie probably knows, yeah, well, whatever, like you still love me, like it doesn't really matter how he acts. All right, and finally, we have the character of Christ as poet. I hope you liked the innuendos here that I found. And yeah, we'll get into that. So it's pretty interesting to see Jesus kind of outside of the maybe God incarnation and more as like an artist and him, as we said, being the predecessor
The
of
supreme romantic artist.
yeah,
which is interesting that he's associating Christ with romanticism.
right, exactly.
Like he even talks about how he's not like a Byronic figure. The Byronic hero of some strains of romanticism is more a satanic figure than a Christ-like figure, right?
Let's get into that a little bit later when we're in that deep into that section. Also, because I don't really have a smart answer for you, so it's my way of avoiding. All right, very brief outline of his life. We mentioned that he was born in Dublin. He initially read classics at Trinity College in Dublin. He then won a scholarship to Oxford, began publishing poetry. Interestingly, traveled through the US on a lecture tour for about 7 months in 1882 and gave something like 100 lectures in that time, which is just really funny to imagine. This British dandy wearing, knee-high flamboyant clothing. I'm not expressing that very well, but I know that he was wearing some rather dandy clothes, and apparently impressing audiences just with his oratory skills. Do you have any thoughts about what that would have been like, or any ideas about that
Well,
particular?
Mark Twain did the same thing around the same period.
In reverse.
He would have
In reverse.
he would
yeah.
have. What do you mean in reverse?
Well, Mark Twain's America. So you mean he went to Europe?
Yeah, but he also did lecture tours in the States, I believe.
Okay. I guess I'm just saying more like a gay Brit.
Right.
That's
but,
interesting.
It's kind of like they would have been like the stand-up comedians of their day, right? Like they had their set pieces, their routines, their bits, and they would just go on tours and play these music halls or whatever, and it was quite popular and quite successful.
That's a good way for me to think about that.
Yeah, I think they did pretty well, and those are just two examples. I'm sure there were other authors that did that as well. They would maybe read passages from their works and then tell some stories and maybe ask for some questions from the audience. This is before TV, right? So what are people going to do?
I'm curious about how much he altered his material for his audience. Like, would he have had like an East Coast, educated that maybe he could relate to much, or that would be more similar to what he would find at home versus some kind of like tent gathering in Deep South? I mean, I think he was very perceptive and knew how to play with and cater to audiences, but that would have been interesting just to see how he how, the different types of audiences he addressed, and how he would have done that. Okay. Picture of Dorian Gray is published 1891 after he returns, and in 1895, so he was 64, 74, 84, 90, 41 when the shit really kicks off. He has the libel trial. He's imprisoned. He leaves prison, I guess, around the age of 43, and 3 years later, he's dead of cerebral meningitis, and he's currently buried in Paris. Okay, if I can keep going,
I've been to his tomb.
Oh, nice,
Yeah,
cool. I didn't even know you'd been to Paris.
Yeah, it's because it's such a popular site. I mean, that's a great cemetery. There are all kinds of people buried there, and then there's another one nearby that has equally, renowned residents, I guess you could say. But I mean, along with the Jim Morrison tomb, right? Burial site is one of the most closely guarded and protected of any there. There's some famous names you can walk right up to the tombstone, and touch it. But Oscar Wilde's, it's kind of like a mausoleum, and there's like a plastic. I mean, it's like encased in glass, I guess, or plastic.
I read something that people
Plexiglass or
often like
something.
leave lipstick on that.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah.
Anyway,
Well, and send love notes, throw them over flowers. I mean, they do that with Sartre and de Beauvoir's gravestones too. But you can walk right up to them, leave like a bottle of wine, or yeah, kiss.
cool.
You can kiss it. You can leave a love note.
So this comes from a historian. I believe his name was Michael Sturgis or Matthew Sturgis. So brief context around their relationship. So
This
something
is
I was listening to
chapter
today,
2, right?
Yeah, now we're in chapter 2 now. We're focusing in on the dynamic of their relationship, maybe what their relationship, how it would have been received at the time, and how Wilde was perceiving it from a maybe more historical perspective. So a documentary that I listened to today said that Wilde may have not even known that he was gay for much of his life. He married, as we know, and he had children. And it's almost like this documentary was arguing that other people knew he was gay before he did, like maybe just because of the way he carried himself. And then it's almost like the idea was introduced to him that this world could exist and that it might be something worth exploring. And in this little quote I've got here, it references something that I think many of us think about when we think about the types of relationships that Oscar was pursuing, and perhaps Oscar and Boosey themselves. It goes back to ancient Greece, to Plato's Symposium, when Socrates he says that if a man wanted to produce beautiful children, he would find a beautiful woman, but if a man wanted to create a beautiful work of art, that he should find a beautiful youth, a male youth. And Wilde will make similar defenses in court, although it's a hard sell, obviously. But yeah, do you want to respond to just kind of the historical aspects of the types of relationships that Oscar got himself into?
In that impassioned speech, he mentions Da Vinci, the sonnets of Shakespeare, and as you say, Plato and Socrates. I mean, that was a Greek tradition. It's called erastes eromenos, the lover and the beloved. The lover being an older man and the beloved being a younger man, and it was, thought to be a kind of initiation. It was even thought to be a kind of training for marriage, and not only that, but life in Greek society in general, right? Like the older man would educate the younger man. Um,
So it wasn't
maybe
something that was. Did it something that was it something that pervaded all tiers of Greek society though, or was it like limited to like these intellectual aristocratic types?
there's ambiguity about it, because in the plays of Aristophanes, you have like the local queer satirized and ridiculed. It's like, oh, don't go. I can't remember the character's name. Is it Cleisthenes? Maybe don't go to his house because there's a line of men waiting to fuck him in the ass. That's Aristophanes, very vulgar and um, direct. But so it was kind of like there was the spiritualized um, relationship, platonic, right? It's more about a spiritual education, and then there was the more um, erotic,
Carnal.
um, focused, yeah, carnal relationship where dirty old men would chase after young boys without really being concerned about their education or caring about them as or their spiritual development, let's say.
Right. Should we
So
keep
I don't know.
moving?
Is that just sublimated? What can we say? Propaganda? Like that? Of course, there was always the element of the carnal. I mean, you could ask that question about any so-called platonic relationship. Is that real? Like the ideal? It's always rooted in the real, isn't it? There's always some physical something there, even in the most. I mean, I would argue that the most spiritual relationship has to be rooted in the physical. And even Plato himself talks about how it's we begin with the physical and then sort of work our way up to the spiritual. So there's always something rooted in the physical. If you pull out the roots, what's left? I would
So
argue
your
not
main
much.
point being that in Oscar Wilde's case that it starts as lust. That's
I don't know if
essentially
it.
what you're
I don't
saying,
know if
right?
we say that. I don't know if we say that it starts as that, but I don't think we can deny that it's there. Even
Yeah.
if he, even if he, with his fancy rhetoric, wants to claim that it's a purely. I mean, does he go so far as to say my relationship with Bosie is purely spiritual? I don't think so. He admits that what the paradox was to him in the realm of philosophy, the perversion was in the realm of pleasure or whatever the quote is. You know what I'm
Yeah,
talking
we'll get into
about.
that a little bit later.
Yeah. So I think he knows on some level, whether subconscious or not, that he's got this physical hankering as well. It's like rooted in the body. You can't really deny that.
Of course. Okay,
But
I think
many do, both Platonic idealists and Christians, who are, you could say, the philosophical heirs of Platonism or Neoplatonism, right? Like they try to deny the body. Nietzsche said Christianity gave Eros poison to drink. It's like a denial of material reality and all those things that were recognized by Freud as being discontents of civilization, right? The denial of all those instinctual urges.
shall
That
we?
that may have taken us too far afield, but
No, I think
it's
it's
related.
interesting stuff. Absolutely, absolutely. So let me see. what I wanted to pull out from this next quote. Okay, we can skip ahead, and we've got a second timeline which I will briefly go through because it just focuses more on maybe the scandals and Wilde's homosexuality. 1835 were the last known executions for sodomy, and you can stop me at any point. 1885, gross indecency was outlawed between men in public and private. 1890, the picture of Dorian Gay was published. So I'll just jump in, I guess, and just say a couple things that I've heard arguments made that Oscar Wilde actually set homosexuals back significantly by kind of pushing things too far, by not being cautious enough about the age gap. It seemed like at the time, gay relationships, especially in the higher echelons of society, were tacitly accepted,
tolerated.
They were tolerated, and that may have continued. But if it went too far, it's like the backlash was more profound, and so those relationships were now threatened. The ones that were able to exist prior, like there was a massive exodus apparently of gay men leaving the country after Wilde is indicted, which I found pretty interesting. Like,
so this is the argument of the incrementalists, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
He pushed for too much too soon.
Yeah, which I think is a bit ridiculous. I mean, it was, this kind of, it's bound to happen if it can happen.
Well, I was just going to say on the mention of sodomy there, right? Like, how is that defined? One interesting detail from the Ellman biography that GJV shared with me. Apparently, Wilde was not into anal copulation. He preferred oral and intercrural, which is, between the thighs. So picture that, people.
Interesting.
And probably that was the Greek way from what we know about it. It's depicted on some Greek vases or whatever, but the lover would engage in intercrural copulation with his younger beloved.
Thank you.
And in fact, that was, I know a lot about this because I studied classics, right? Like, it was, a citizen was not supposed to allow himself to be anally penetrated, right? Like, the intercrural thing was okay, but the ass fucking was a step too far. We're talking about, accelerationism. So really, the incrementalists should have been happy with Wilde because he was an advocate for the intercrural thing.
So this is
I like
where
how you just gloss over that.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking about my future positions as a statesman and CEO, so I want to make sure I don't give them any fuel, any hot quotes.
Well, if they do, you just attack them on Twitter as a homophobe and they're done. They're canceled.
Sure. So this is where, if somebody's kind of hyped about Oscar Wilde's biography more from like the soap opera point of view, which I think there's undoubtedly an appeal there, like there was for me after reading this. I wanted to just get all the dirt and figure out all the details about how these scandals developed and so on. So the Marquess was kind of already had a horrible toxic relationship with Boosey, and he was infuriated by Wilde and his son parading around various parts of England and living the high life. So he was gradually honing in on his prey. Paradigmatic shift in Wilde's life is when he leaves a card. This whole thing is kind of bizarre to me, like just the manners or the way that something like this would have been done, the thought behind it, and like its impact. And I don't know how much you read about this particular incident, but yeah, he leaves a card. He leaves his personal card at a private club that Wilde's attending, and I should have better prepared, but it reads for Oscar Wilde posing Somdomite,
He
which
can't even spell it
is
correctly.
true. But today on the documentary I was listening to, they said that would have been intentional, and it also was like a high class misspelling or like a intentional high class like affectations. I don't know how to decipher that, like why that would be the case. So any thoughts on this whole sequence with the like why that
Uh,
would have been some kind of dagger
well, I
or
don't know.
especially
I guess
large source of shame?
we'd have to be well. I don't think it was necessarily like in the film. He's just urged by Robbie and others to ignore it. Just ignore it. And if he had done that, you know, very likely the incident would have been forgotten. But he and Boosey are the ones that made something out of it, and tried to make a defamation suit out of it.
Right.
I mean, if you look at the handwriting, it's what's been deciphered as posing is completely illegible to me. But okay, Somdomite is clear enough, I guess. Although that's a strange looking S. But
And this posing as is interesting. This
yeah,
word posing, because it's like he's not accusing him directly of being gay. He's like saying, "How dare you pretend to be gay?" Right? Which
yeah,
is weird.
which is a which is a charge that was levied against David Bowie, for example.
To be posing as a sodomite,
Yeah, like the
like
whole
milking it kind of thing.
right, the whole Ziggy Stardust persona being just a persona, right? Just a
Uh-huh.
pose. I mean,
So
does it matter? Like, so the real Somdomite is more honorable than the posing Somdomite, or less
or
honorable, or
maybe
what?
it was
Like,
just like a higher degree of, it would have been even more outrageous for him to directly call him that. Or I don't
yeah,
know.
I think we'd have to know more about Victorian or fin de siècle
Yeah, I'm sure some
mores.
historians could,
Like,
or
that's
perhaps
that
even your
whole.
co-author.
Well, I mean, see, that's another aspect of this. There's a lot of classism at play here, right? Like, this is not the world of people like you and me, or maybe I should only speak for myself, but like, I don't move in those circles, and I wouldn't have at that time. But throughout De Profundis, Saint Oscar refers to himself as a man of my position, a man of my distinguished name, a name which was made famous in the realms of archaeology, art, literature, and so on. So it's
Mm.
that whole concern with family and name and reputation, like, that's somewhat foreign to me. Although,
Yeah,
I've been
so and in
involved
that
in
sense,
legal, I've been involved in lawsuits that impugn various people's professional reputation. So I can understand the desire to defend one's name, but
yeah, I mean, I think you're right to bring that up in terms of, we know in Russian noble society, right? That was like the big thing, like to defame your reputation. Well, then
challenge
I'm
you to
gonna
a
propose.
duel.
Yeah, I'm gonna propose a duel, and I'm ready to die for this like effrontery. So yeah, okay. Here we just have a bit more information about the specifics of his imprisonment. Wilde was questioned on Alfred's poem Two Loves, which we'll talk about a little bit later. and then he's receives the maximum sentence. It's a bit weird for me that maximum sentence would be 2 years. Like there's something kind of, I thought that was a bit odd. But I guess it's just a little bit of ass play. So, um, but he's transferred, I think, several times. And I heard today again on this documentary that in the final prison, where I guess that's the Reading jail, the caretaker is a bit more forgiving, and he's finally able to acquire writing paper and so on. So, okay, we got the last section. I'll just zoom through this. We mentioned that after prison, he only publishes once, and it's the Ballad of Reading Jail, which he publishes under the moniker S3E2, which was his cell block. I thought that was kind of interesting. 1967, if we're just talking about the history of gay rights struggle now, homosexuality was decriminalized. And in 2017, Wilde was pardoned as part of the Alan Turing Law, which I don't know what that is, but it's interesting because if he was having sex with underage men, you wonder why he would be entitled to like a full British government pardon, besides the
That's
fact that
good.
maybe they just want.
It's good PR. Good PR. We mentioned Alan Turing in our episode on Chat GPT. Remember?
Yeah, but I forget what it means.
Well,
I think you were the.
The Turing test is meant to determine whether um, you're engaging in dialogue with a human or a computer, right? Like, can the computer
Yeah.
appropriately mimic a human? That's the Turing
But can
test.
you understand why that would be the Alan Turing Law?
Yeah, because he was homosexual and was persecuted for that.
I didn't
He's
know
the
any of
one
that.
who he's the one who bit down on the cyanide uh, poisoned apple like Snow White and killed himself because
Okay.
he was being hounded.
Okay, we're in chapter 3 now. Oops, Oscar did a boo-boo. Here you see the prison in Reading pictured, and we know that potentially you could argue that the Marquise is responsible for all of this, for Wilde's persecution and so on. And I know you liked this particular quote, so maybe you can read it and just mention your reaction to these personages.
Your father, he's talking to Boosey, of course. Your father will always live among the kind, pure-hearted or pure-minded parents of Sunday school literature. Your place is with the infant Samuel, and in the lowest mire of Malebolge, I sit between Gilles de Retz and the Marquis de Sade. So you've got pictures of presumably the infant Samuel, and
Yep.
looks like Malebolge, which is one of
Right.
Dante's circles of hell. And then you've got this character that I had to look up, Gilles de Retz, who is a notorious child murderer that fought with Joan of Arc. I didn't know that. And Marquis de Sade, that's not a picture of him I've seen before, but yeah, well-known author of Justine and 120 Days of Sodom and other great works of
Have you read
literature.
his stuff then? Do you
Sade,
recommend
yeah.
it?
Well, if you have the stomach for it, but I mean, it's like
Okay.
1,000 pages of atrocities. I mean, you get
Nice.
the idea. You get the idea after 20 pages, but it is the ultimate in transgressive literature, like the most atrocious things humans are capable of.
And when you say
He
that,
narrates them.
I always I don't know why, but I had some kind of perception of him just being like a Casanova figure, but extreme.
Not at
So
all.
that's not the case.
Well, I mean, the term sadism comes
I mean, is it all
from him, and
sexual
it's
or
not
is it
just
other stuff too?
no. It's all it's homicidal. but
Okay.
often mixed with sexuality. Like they'll rape these the heroes and heroines that are the ringleaders of these activities. They often engage in sexual torture and rape before they kill their victims, many of whom are underage. And there's shit eating and dog fucking and just the most appalling things that humans are capable of. And it's
Is
just a
it
catalog of crimes.
biographical?
Well, he wrote all of his major works in prison as well. Saad did.
Okay, but I mean, is it written from any particular tone? Is it celebratory? Is it just
Yeah, it's just
descriptive? Is it
it's I mean, it is just a catalog of crimes in an attempt to show, number one, like his rhetorical purpose is quite the opposite of Wilde's. Like he's completely antichrist, atheistic, um, and it's a celebration of hatred and murder. Um,
okay?
and
Okay,
and the intention is to attack the hypocrisy of the revolutionary society which imprisoned him. He's saying society commits every crime that it punishes criminals for. It's punishing me. I'm in prison for whatever it was he did. Maybe sexual impropriety. I think he was in and out of prison, but like this is a society that just uh, recently chopped off the heads of a large number of people with the guillotine, right? And they're putting me in prison. These same people that murdered the nobility, they're gonna have the audacity to, condemn others. I mean, just the fact that they're claiming for themselves the right to execute others is hypocrisy. That's
okay.
his
Maybe we can
argument.
come back to that. Yeah, that's interesting. Um, Next, I've got a quote from Wilde about the importance of conversation. I guess the only thing I really wanted to pull out here is that this stark contrast that Wilde is making between himself and Boosey. And so he's saying that because they come from different educational levels, uh, he was often reduced to kind of speaking Boosey's language, which was more trivial, just based around like charms and stuff, and how little intellectual stimulation he ultimately got from Boosey. And he'd often say that his times with Boosey were just dry, completely dry artistically, and that he couldn't produce anything when he was around, and that he, as soon as
But he
Boosey would
kept
go off
coming
somewhere,
back.
that's when he, yeah, exactly. So ultimately, it's kind of on him. Let me just see. Okay, this is just kind of a funny micro picture of their whole relationship. So Wilde says, "Often in old days, I had told you that you were ruining my life. You had always laughed." So, and it's almost like the laugh actually is an appropriate response. You know what I mean? Like when someone says that to you, like, what, that you have the right to laugh. Really, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
unless you've got them
Well,
trapped in a cage physically, and like you've
yeah.
actually like forced them to be with you. But in the context that Wilde was in, I can see why Bosie would have laughed as a response.
hmm
Any
Because,
thoughts on
yeah,
that, or should we keep
well,
going?
as you say, it's on Wild, right? Like, okay, you're
Yeah,
so miserable. Why don't you leave?
yeah. I mean, even though we know that he did make like Bosie made it hard for him to leave, but still, yeah. Well, I would just say like that level of melodrama. Although Bosie's the king of melodrama. Anyway, just a kind of funny quote. He says, describing Bosie, "Through your father, you come of a race, marriage with whom is horrible, friendship fatal, and that lays violent hands either on its own life or on the lives of others. So yeah, I just thought what I thought was amusing about these types of attacks was, on the one hand, he's constantly, trying to give all this moral advice to Boosey and referencing Christ and humility, but insulting someone, that's not Christian. Like, it's like you can't be some great moral character if you're attacking someone else. The two just don't go together. So like the patronizing tone.
While at the same time, you know, elevating the importance of your own race or family, right? Like the great Wilde name that you caused me to sully.
Yes, I just think like attacking him all the time, that's just not, that wouldn't be like a morally mature. I mean, maybe the word, even me throwing in moral, I know is like questionable, but you get my point, I think. Like,
well, it's
an
not
ethically
it's not
sophisticated
Christ,
position.
It's not Christ-like, So of course there's that contradiction, which is maybe one of the charms of the text, right? Like it's just This is how one expresses himself de profundis, like from the depths. You can't necessarily expect one to be morally consistent or even rhetorically consistent. Like he's going to be all over the place, full of all kinds of emotions, rage, but at the same time, forgiveness, or, he's going to be trying to forgive. So
these are just a couple of
multivariate.
Absolutely. This is just a couple of maybe interesting historical notes for people who want to follow the trajectory of their lives. I found a couple images from 2 source texts that are very relevant to the biographies of both men. On the left, we see an edition of The Spirit Lamp, which was the Oxford magazine that Lord Alfred Douglas published several issues of, which Wilde wrote for, and which contained Lord Alfred Douglas's poem Two Loves. And actually, no, it didn't. My bad. It did not. What I wanted to say is it was just the magazine that Lord Alfred Douglas was editing and that Wilde contributed to. And another magazine which only produced 2 issues. But both of these, I guess I would say, as the quote says at the bottom, were magazines of an overt, indeed an aggressive homosexual character. And in The Chameleon, that's where he published Two Loves. So just kind of interesting to think about undergrad magazines, the kind of desire to, to express your progressive thoughts and passions of the day. And this was like, so I think that's a cool urge. I guess I like the kind of even if it wasn't self-published, but the sort of self-starting and somewhat like provocative nature of magazines like those. And I think about Coriolis whenever I think about stuff like this. Do you want to say anything about that, or shall I move on?
You can carry on.
Okay. The love that dare not speak its name. I know you wanted to speak to that, so I'll just briefly say that it's a phrase from the last line of the poem Two Loves by Lord Alfred Douglas, written in September 1892 and published in the Oxford magazine The Chameleon. It was mentioned at Oscar Wilde's gross indecency trial and is usually interpreted as a euphemism for homosexuality. Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, that phrase in particular is picked up on by Joyce, especially in Ulysses. I believe it is Stephen Dedalus who talks about Shakespeare's infatuation with the love that dare not speak its name. But of course, the phrase comes from, I always thought it was from Wilde himself, but we learned that it's from the Wilde trial. and it's actually Boosey's phrase, which, give him credit for the phrasing. It's pretty good.
Yeah.
The
Um,
love that dare not speak its name. It even scans as iambics.
yeah, I don't know. Have you seen the film Call Me by Your Name?
No, but I know
Okay,
the basic synopsis.
yeah, it's very good, and I don't know. I didn't know if there's any relationship there between these two, but thought it's
Well,
interesting
they
the
called each
importance of
other.
naming.
They called one another by each called the other
Right.
by the other's name, right? So
Sure, but
there's kind of like an unwillingness to be too direct and to speak the true name, I guess. You have to engage in subterfuge
maybe, but
and
also it was like massive. It felt empowering in the film, I would say. So
I didn't
in a
see it,
way, it was
so
kind of yeah, it was kind of like. But also, there is this type of Uranian. I just saw that word on the previous slide.
mm,
Uranian relationship between
older
the
and younger.
Timothy. Yeah, what's his name? Do you know that guy? Timothy something.
Chalamet,
Timothy Chalamet
Timothée,
and his master.
Timothée Chalamet.
Yes, yes.
Well,
So
and I think just what I know. Again, I haven't seen the film, but wasn't there a backlash about the age differential? Some of the more
yeah,
puritanical or Philistine um, viewers were upset by that. So it's
right.
same issue. That the attack on Puritanism and Philistinism in De Profundis is still very much a modern concern. It's like we have all these
Hmm.
censors that are just looking to find something to cancel people for. And all of it is hypocrisy, right? Like, who are you to condemn anyone? If you want to look at it from a Christ-like perspective, okay, she sinned. You who Any of you who are without sin, feel free to pick up the first stone. Go ahead. Oh
Right.
no?
So I don't know how useful this next quote is, except that again, it will just give our audience a sense of the the way that Wilde continues to refer to Boise. I just found it amusing, this particular wording. He said, I also had my illusions. This is Wilde speaking, obviously. I thought life was going to be a brilliant comedy, and that you were to be one of many graceful figures in it. I found it to be a revolting and repellent tragedy, and that the sinister occasion of the great catastrophe, sinister in its concentration of aim and intensity of narrowed willpower, was yourself. I think that is ripped or tripped. Ah,
stripped, right?
stripped, thank you. Stripped of that mask of joy and pleasure by which you, no less than I, had been deceived and led astray. Any comment or move on?
Well, there's that word mask again,
Yeah.
which is so, he's Oscar, that is, Saint Oscar is responsible for the paradox. Give a man a mask and he'll tell you the truth. So that was
Nice.
early days, right? That was before De Profundis, but I would argue that he never really contradicted that. Like
And something,
even yeah, go
no,
ahead.
no, no, just something I heard today on this documentary was pretty cool. It's like the further he got into this double life and visiting brothels and so on, the kind of more brutal and acerbic his plays became. So it's like in his own double life, he saw the mask that he was wearing and he felt like added vitriol and an added desire to expose everybody else. And so that's why these would be like criticisms of class as like the main theme of his plays, which I'd like to get to know better. By the way, I don't really consider myself versed in his plays at all. Um, okay, let's go to this quote. Do you want to? I thought it was an interesting quote. So, do you want to read it and respond a little
Sure.
bit?
Yeah, I highlighted this too because it's mentioned more than once. Um, the supreme vice is shallowness. Whatever is realized is right. Um, the first part of that is key because, as I say, it appears at least 3 or 4 times in the text.
I think the second part is more interesting, but go on.
Well, um, shallowness is the opposite of profundity, which is echoed in the Latin title, right? Like from the
Right,
depths. That's depth is the opposite of shallowness, isn't it? So
right.
without the experience of suffering and sorrow and pain, if you only experience pleasure, which is what he attempted to do earlier in life, he says,
And accuses Boosey of
yes,
representing.
you're not a full human. You've got to experience the dark side too. I mean, I would agree with that personally. I mean, I think even as an artist, if you don't know suffering and sorrow, like how great an artist can you be?
And I don't remember who said whatever is right. Do you know?
Pope,
I feel like it's someone like Pope, yeah?
yeah.
Yeah, I remember being really excited by that quote as an undergraduate. And I think this is like an interesting next step from that. Like, for Wilde, and we'll get into this a little bit more when we talk about the Christianity, but that realization is crucial because it represents growth. So it's not the same as saying whatever is right, right? It's like
Mm.
for him, all the value is in this, like, is in this realization, this learning. I thought that's interesting to just the constant epiphanies that you can have. Um, okay,
Just so you know, we're bumping up on an hour and a half, but carry on.
okay, all right. I'll just mention this quote, even if it's a bit slightly trite. I'll just mention it because I have like an interesting little side note. So Oscar says, I said to myself, at all costs, I must keep love in my heart. If I go into prison without love, what will become of my soul? Um, and kind of tangentially, I just wanted to say that when the guilty verdict is given and he knows that prison awaits him, apparently both Boosey and Robbie, encouraged him to literally jump ship and go to France, and he refuses. We don't exactly maybe know why, but basically, it apparently wasn't in his nature, to want to run. And
Well,
it's kind of
his
connected
mom
here, like
said
he.
his mom encouraged him to stay. His mom was a
Okay,
fiery Irish nationalist, and she said it would be disgraceful if he fled. Stay and
okay,
fight.
interesting. Okay, so did she realize like the extent of his activities and so on?
I think so.
And so she's just like, "Do you, son?"
I think so.
Okay, that's interesting. Uh, this is just an interesting little quote here, and this is another reason, yeah, why maybe he didn't feel that ashamed. I mean, he does. That's his relationship to shame is interesting, and I think we get different views of it. We get stalwart defenses of it with him referencing Greek tradition and so on, and then we get other times where he feels big regret because it's like he does recognize that he was being hedonistic to unhealthy degrees and that it hurt his art, it hurt his productivity. So you get both sides of Wilde, but he says here, sins of the flesh are nothing. They are maladies for physicians to cure, if they should be cured. Sins of the soul alone are shameful. Do you want to say anything about that? Or we can keep going?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, he's ambivalent about it. So carry on.
But it's a nice idea just to kind of grade these two types of sins and emphasize the fact that like this gay sex is ultimately a sin of the flesh, which shouldn't have such a powerful reaction from society. Uh, we'll skip that. Okay, just this introduces this idea of sorrow. Sorrow is the most sensitive of all created things, and he places a lot of emphasis in the latter section of the text on elevating the status of sorrow as, like, in a way, the supreme life experience, supreme emotion, because of the clarity it brings. And he argues, and I hope I have a quote here somewhere, where, yeah, he's first here. He says sorrow is the supreme emotion which man is capable. Um, and here, yeah, I think this is another interesting compliment. Behind joy and laughter, there may be a temperament coarse, hard, and callous, but behind sorrow, there is always sorrow. Pain, unlike pleasure, wears no mask. Can you speak to this kind of collection
Well,
of thoughts?
again, I would dispute that. I think pain can have many masks.
But is there a grain of truth to what he's saying?
Well, it may be what um, Pirandello would call a naked mask, like the mask of sorrow is more of a naked mask. It's still a mask, but you can see through it in a way. But it's still, I think, the search for the authentic self, the sincere self, is maybe, you know, pointless in a way. There's still going to be some kind of masking, some kind of presentation going on. And if we just accept that, there's no essential, in a Buddhist sense, there's no essential self.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all that. I guess I just think I'm often thinking about myself and how, like, this year I'm on antidepressants. A year ago I wasn't. Now I'm feeling like absolutely fine, good. When I'm at work, I'm fully like just I'm like a machine in terms of like work. I'm enthusiastic about what I'm doing. I'm very focused. And I remember like a year ago, without the bolstering of the medication, like the kind of rawness and the like desperation that I was feeling emotionally, that again, you could just say it's just another incarnation of like no solid self, but I required people to help me. Like I remember calling you at the gym. I remember the way I would talk to Carlos at school, and it was like that vulnerability. Yeah, you can't afford yourself that kind of quiet confidence that might come with just feeling like normal. You know what I'm saying? So when you're desperate, in that sense, there is some truth to what he's saying. That's my only point. And I'm sure you've had those moments where you're just, when you're desperate, I don't know what you would call that. What would you call that then? Those moments where you just can't, you don't have that composure.
I don't
Would
know,
you
a
consider that a
crisis,
kind of dropping of a mask?
crisis of confidence.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but would
yeah. I mean, maybe so, but when you're at the stage of writing about it or representing that sorrow, which is what he's doing in this letter, right? It's one thing to experience the rawness of the sorrow in the moment, but then when you take the step of representing that sorrow and pain and writing, then I believe you're always adopting a mask of some sort.
especially if you're writing so well. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, to the point, I guess, where you can like plan your language.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I just want to read you this tiny quote because it, and tell me if you get the, if you can, you have to guess why I included it. Maybe if I read it a certain way, you might, or first I'll let you guess and then I'll read it in a certain tone and see if you can guess. So, another topic that he brings up frequently is Lord Alfred Douglas wanting Wilde to write an intro for a series of poems that Boosey wants to publish, and Wilde is like incredibly insulted. I think that he doesn't ask directly, but he asks through someone, if I'm remembering correctly. And anyway, he goes on to say to Boosey, "Your little book should have brought with it Sicilian and Arcadian airs, not the pestilent foulness of the criminal dock or the close breath of the convict cell." Okay, do you get why I put this in now? Or do you need a clue?
I need a clue,
Okay.
I think.
Okay, here's the clue. It's like, your little book? No?
Your little book, I mean, all I can think of is
Yeah.
Qui dono lepidum libellum from Catullus, little book. But I'm sure that's not what you mean.
No, I'm referencing Ken talking about your little pamphlet.
Ah, okay.
Because I think he says it with the same tone, you know? Your little book.
It's dismissive, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, no, he said your paper. That's how he referred to
Right.
your
But
paper.
you can feel that same tone from Wilde.
Yeah.
And I don't think he never rated him. This is too far.
I like the death notice, yeah.
Yeah, but we should hit it up later, if we're gonna hit it up at all.
All right, well, we're 90 minutes in.
I understand. So, but we have to touch on Jesus a little bit, unless you want to do a part two, which it's up to you. Like, I could do a part two.
No, let's carry on.
Okay. All right. Do you want to read this? I just think this speaks to like the ego stuff.
That beautiful, unreal world of art where once I was king, and would have remained king indeed, had I not let myself be lured into the imperfect world of coarse, uncompleted passion, of appetite without distinction, desire without limit, and formless greed. Yeah, he let himself be lured, so it's all Boosey's fault.
That penitent nature versus the proud one as well, though, because there is some degree of penitence there, and also just funny the whole like talking about himself as like a king. And
well, you use the word penitence, right? Which of course is related to the word penitentiary, which is, one of the original purposes of incarceration, at least as conceived by certain religious authorities of his day, right? Like the purpose of prison is to teach the sinner to repent and save his soul,
right?
As opposed to punishing the member of civil society for his crime against society. The idea of the penitentiary is that, we're going to save the soul of these wayward, sinners,
Wilde seems grateful though to prison many times.
That's what I'm saying.
So
that's what I'm saying.
The experience. Yeah.
In a sense, he's like a model of success for that ideology, right? Now, personally, I don't accept that, and he doesn't either to some degree. He knows that what's been done to him has been horrible, but at the same time, he does feel a kind of gratitude for being given or having been given the opportunity to experience suffering on this level and making him a more rounded human and a better artist and so on. But it's just those two different concepts. I mean, does anyone even have that pretense today that prison is a penitentiary to help sinners reform and save their souls? Of course not. It's all
maybe some Scandinavian prisons.
Yeah, but I'm sure that's true, and it is built on reform. But I'm thinking of like an American prison. Is it ever about that? Not only is it about punishing the evildoer, the citizen who committed a crime against the state, but also it's like financialized, right? We got private prisons where that have a certain number of beds that need to be filled so they can remain profitable.
And they'll often get them to do actual work, which they'll sell.
It's also an excuse for slave. It's also slave labor. I mean, that's another aspect of this, right? Like one of the things I learned Wilde did was, spend time on the treadmill. It's literally the treadmill.
Yeah.
They're walking on this mill generating what?
Look, I have a picture right here.
Mm-hmm. I saw that. Yeah.
There's the treadmill.
Yeah. So what are they doing? Are they generating? Is it?
I don't know the details.
Yeah,
but it was supposed to be absolutely brutal.
Yeah, and now that's like we use the exact same term. Oh, I got to spend some time on the treadmill. Going to the going to the gym. At one time, it was a punishment. Now it's like what people do to keep themselves in shape, and it's like a voluntary leisure activity. So
right. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit. I know we're short on time. I will read, you react, we move on, okay?
Mm-hmm.
This is the height of Wilde's ego in this text. I was a man who stood in symbolic relations to the art and culture of my age. I had realized this for myself at the very dawn of my manhood, and had forced my age to realize it afterwards. Few men hold such a position in their own lifetime and have it so acknowledged. It is usually discerned, if discerned at all, by the historian or the critic, long after both the man and his age have passed away. With me it was different. I felt it myself and made others feel it. Byron was a symbolic figure, but his relations were to the passion of his age and its weariness of passion. Mine were to something more noble, more permanent, of more vital issue, of larger scope. Take it away.
Modesty.
Especially about the Byronic stuff. What?
Absolute humility, he said, is what he arrived at.
Yeah, exactly.
But then we have moments like this. Well, the Byronic thing is what I mentioned before. Like the Byronic hero is kind of a satanic figure, whereas the Wildean hero, at least post De Profundis, is kind of a Christ-like figure, and also in the soul of socialism. And he mentions Kropotkin, the Russian.
Okay, help me out though, because let's go a little bit more basic. What does he mean when he says Byron was? I mean, Byron was a symbolic figure. Why would he be? Why would people accuse him of being satanic, as you said, or what's wrong with him?
Because the Byronic.
Yeah, I don't know.
The Byronic hero is kind of a lonely, brooding character. He's rejected by the world. He's got a closet drama called Cain, who is the original.
No, what's the Russian guy that we talked about recently, didn't we? Yeah, but who's the guy? Lermontov.
Lermontov.
That's all about that. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. Well, but Wilde mentions Kropotkin, and he's kind of like the opposite, the beautiful Russian soul that we've seen examples of in recent years, and he mentions Kropotkin, who's, kind of like a Tolstoyan figure in the sense that he attacks a kind of socialism. I don't know. I think Kropotkin may have been a kind of social anarchist, but there's kind of a Tolstoyan humanity, Christ-like humanity about him.
Okay.
Which is the opposite. Do you have any thoughts of that antisocial, brooding, outcast, Byronic character?
Do you have any thoughts about Wilde, the art critic? I think that was something that he really wanted to make his mark around, is his views on art. Do you feel like you got enough in this text to really make an argument about it or respond to it directly?
Well, not so much in this text, although he does mention Pater and or Ruskin, right? Who were aesthetic theorists, and their theories very much influenced him. I think he studied with one or both of them at Oxford.
Ruskin. I heard about that he helped Ruskin build a road.
Yeah, so he's coming from that tradition, and he was very much influenced by it, and he wanted to express his own theories of aesthetics. And I think after prison, he got an entirely different view. Uh, Whereas before, maybe the ideal was the Greeks, right? Now he's seeing like the beauty in Christian art, and
Right.
his great hero seems to be Saint Francis of Assisi. You know.
Although he says, unlike Assisi, poverty wasn't a great marriage for me. Uh, so just interestingly, like he talks about how successful he is about kind of marrying paradox. He says the false and the truth are merely forms of intellectual existence. He goes on to say that what paradox was to me in the sphere of thought, perversity became to me in the sphere of passion. Desire at the end was a malady or a madness or both. Um, yeah, it's interesting just the intrigue that led to some of his behavior. I'm trying to cut myself short there, so let's
Well,
keep going.
give us a synopsis of the Christian section and Christ
Yeah,
as
sure, sure.
romantic
Oh, I was hoping on
hero.
doing more than a synopsis, but I'm just cutting this part short.
Mm.
Uh, okay, let's keep going. We kind of talked about that a little bit. He says the secret of life is suffering now. All right, whereas before that definitely hadn't been the case. Um, Here I think we get a kind of like Blakean atmosphere. He says, I don't regret for a single moment having lived for pleasure. I did it to the full, as one should do everything that one does. And that's a very much like road of excess leads to palace of wisdom, Blakean
Mm-hmm.
atmosphere. But now he says the other half of the garden had its secrets for me also, which I like the wording there. Uh, and to have continued the same life would have been wrong because it would have been limiting. And this is just a really nice section as well. When he describes his life in the quote unquote underworld, he says it was like feasting with panthers. I don't feel at all ashamed of having known them. They were intensely interesting. What I do feel ashamed of is the horrible Philistine atmosphere into which you brought me. And if you don't mind, like, briefly speaking to just the whole concept of Philistine, because I don't really understand it too well. So if you could just give me like a dummy explanation of like that
Well,
concept.
I mean, it reminds me of Matthew Arnold's attacks on the Hebrews versus the Hellenists, right? Like Matthew Arnold advocated a culture of sweetness and light as opposed to, I don't know, Hebraist or Pharisee or Philistine focus on propriety. The Philistine is only concerned about obeying the norms of the particular society in which he finds himself, right? And so,
What's the relationship between Philistine and Pharisee?
well, the Pharisees were the um, the law abiding religious officials that considered Jesus a
I know that
heretic.
Christ has confrontations with them. Yeah, I understand, but
Yeah.
like, so what are the two terms? Like, is a Pharisee like is the Philistine the umbrella term? I mean, what do you know the etymology of these two
Well,
words?
Philistine is related to Palestine, oddly enough, but they were people that were considered uncultured and um, unenlightened and barbaric, I guess, in biblical times. And
Okay.
there's one scholar who thinks that they may have actually been Greek refugees that settled in Palestine. So
Well, what's the
it's
difference between Philistine and Pharisee? If you were like just defining
well,
them.
Pharisee is a Hebrew, you know, religious official during the time of Christ. Philistine, they're
Okay.
not Hebraic, they're not Hebrews. They're like one of the out groups. But
So it's just
in this
they
context,
resemble one another.
yeah, and that they're both like vulgar, uncultured
Okay.
sticklers for propriety. I would say that might be a good way to describe them. You know, and
Okay.
they're kind of like Puritans. The Philistine, in the way Wilde uses it, he uses it interchangeably with like Puritan. So like Boosey's father would be a Philistine, right? Even though he thought he was all
Right.
daring and rebellious because he was an atheist, but in the end, it was all about upholding the norms of Victorian society.
I'm deferring to you again. I'm putting you on the spot, so you can always pass and we'll go on, but I just wanted some help kind of teasing this out. So, at the end of the section on foreshadowing in his works, Wilde writes that art is a symbol because man is a symbol. And there could be no truer words for Wilde's life as a critic speaking than that the art became a symbol because the man, the artist, became, or maybe always was, a symbol first. I just don't even really understand what it means. Just a simple phrase like man is a symbol. I mean, just the whole idea of like symbol here, I started just getting confused. So, do you have any thoughts on like symbolism or what this could mean?
Well, I think of Wilde as a kind of archetype, right? Like he represents a new kind of artist, a new kind of public figure, a new kind of
Okay. Uh
celebrity,
huh.
you know. And
Uh huh.
actually, in volume 2 of the Aranesque series of novelettes, Wilde's Day,
Oh,
um, we talk about Wilde as being the first British pop star or
right.
Anglo-Irish pop star, right? Like, had it not been for Wilde, there would have been no Mick Jagger or
John
David
Lennon.
Bowie or Morrissey. No, not so much Lennon. I mean, it's he's
No,
like,
I get where you're going now. Yeah, I get where you're
yeah,
going with the Jagger comparison.
he's like the androgynous or gender stereotype defying
Gender
iconoclast,
bender.
you know? Yeah.
Okay, so all right.
So
Yeah,
he
so
became
okay, so like
like
lifestyle being the
even people unfamiliar with his work, maybe they've never read anything, but they recognize him as a cultural icon,
okay,
right? Like, oh, Oscar
like
Wilde.
Andy Warhol.
Yes.
Yeah,
And then, oh, I'm going to wear a flower in my lapel,
sunflower. Yeah.
a lily or whatever. I'm going to wear a flower in my lapel because I'm a Wildian. I can't tell you the names of any of his works, but yeah, I'm a Wildian
Right.
in spirit. I know he was a rebel and he even went to jail for his
Rebel,
alternative
rebel.
he went to jail for his alternative lifestyle. So again, there's like revolution as artifice
Okay.
in a way.
Chapter 5. We're going to talk
Finally,
about Jesus.
for about
Yes.
5
And
minutes.
okay, let's pick out the good stuff here. So, starting out here, Christ, this is Wilde speaking, Christ is the true precursor of the Romantic movement. He realized that imaginative sympathy, which in the sphere of art is the sole secret of creation. I think it's quite a beautiful idea that a sympathy for humans, for other humans, is like the basis of great art. That, the ability to do penetrating empathy. I don't necessarily agree that it's like the sole secret of creation. I mean, we've got all types of arts and ironically, I'm just thinking about this now, but Wilde refers to the book Against Nature. Do you know that?
Mm-hmm.
Which I wouldn't
Heisman's.
describe that as a text. Yeah, I really liked that text, but I wouldn't describe that text as particularly Christ-like or as expressing an imaginative sympathy with all humans. I mean, it's very much like self localized, but
Well, that's important to. I mean, the characters in Dorian Gray are
Yeah.
enamored of that text and the author, as well as Baudelaire.
Uh,
In somewhere in De Profundis, he talks about like the Christ-like sympathies of Baudelaire, which is not something that immediately comes to mind about the author of Les Fleurs du Mal, the flowers of
right.
evil. But okay, he detected like a
But that's
Catholic
part of the fun. Is this
sensitivity.
recasting?
Yeah, sure, I agree.
So speaking about Jesus, Wilde says, "What God was to the pantheist, man was to him." And I really liked this idea that Christ, according to Wilde, was just seeing everybody as an incarnation of God, and that was like fuel for his universal love and his kind of rejection of traditional moral mores. I don't know if I'm using those words correctly, but I'm always trying to experiment.
Well, he talks about how Christ referred to himself alternatively as both the Son of God and the Son of Man, depending on his
Right.
mood or what he
Right.
wanted to emphasize. So, yeah, that was an interesting thing for him to point out. I also like how he
And I think this is
described
go on.
I also like how he described the Gospels as 4 beautiful prose poems. And that's because he went back and read the original Koine Greek, which
We're going to talk about that. I got you.
okay.
I got you covered on all that.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually, what you just said is a nice precursor to this particular quote. For sheer simplicity of pathos, wedded and made one with sublimity of tragic effect, nothing can be said to equal or approach even the last act of Christ's passion. So again, he's very much treating this as literature, and just really seduced by the story and all the details and the portrayal of Christ. It's nice to think about the text, right, rather than like with all the attachments that we have of like the heaviness of religion and just all, he's just seeing it as this story that he's describing. Talk or keep going.
That's how we should. That's how we should approach it.
Sure. And this I added because, again, Wilde is constantly bringing stuff back to the aesthetic. So he says, when he says forgive your enemies, it is not for the sake of the enemy, but for one's own sake that he says so, and because love is more beautiful than hate.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think the way that many people might read this is like, oh, love is good, so that's why it's beautiful. But I don't think that's what Wilde is saying. I think Wilde is saying, no, like, forget the good part of that. Like, love is just aesthetically more beautiful. It's like, stripped of the moral judgments. Love is cool because it's attractive, right? And that's like
I think
an interesting way of thinking about it.
I think he's also saying that it's healthier to the individual that is struggling with those two opposites. For your own health and sanity, you've got to find a way back to love. You can't be consumed with hatred because it'll poison your life. And that also is not a beautiful thing, right?
Sure. But it's interesting that, like, the critical word is beauty. I guess that's the main thing that I'm teasing out there. Okay, so I have this kind of funny meme here. The Jesus Alpha on the right is pretty funny. And so, despite thinking in some way that we've talked about this a lot in different ways over the last couple hours, but on the one hand, we see Wilde as like this descendant of Greek sexuality and an aesthete. Then now he goes on this like extended criticism of Greek religion, Greek gods, where he contrasts the way that they were presented, the role they fulfilled for people, and he explains how superior Jesus is as a historical or religious figure. And I thought this was very interesting. So I'll just summarize. I mean, I guess here's like a section that he really talks about it. But he essentially says that all the Greek gods, they had flaws, and they were very like whether they were vain or selfish, whatever, they had traits that were not beautiful, that were not endearing. Whereas Jesus, to him, is just a much more charismatic character and more seductive. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I can't follow him through all of that, or I don't,
Sure, sure,
I
but
don't endorse everything that he's saying there. You could make the exact
sure,
opposite argument that he's less human because he doesn't have those personality flaws. So
that's true.
I don't
Okay,
know.
then I guess
I
I'm just
just
excited by like the provocative reading, I guess, if it is
mm-hmm.
provocative. Or I'm just not so used to people taking the Christ story out of religion, and just kind of treating it as like an artistic piece to critique. This is pretty funny, and I'm pretty sure you would definitely object to this. But again, I just like it because of kind of how outlandish it is. So he says, to me, one of the things in history the most to be regretted is that the Christ's own Renaissance, which has produced the cathedral at Chartres, the Arthurian cycle of legends, the life of St. Francis of Assisi, the art of Giotto, and Dante's Divine Comedy, was not allowed to develop on its own lines, but was interrupted and spoiled by the dreary classical Renaissance. You gonna
I mean,
respond?
I why do you think I would object to that necessarily?
Well, as soon as I say that, I kind of know that like you might not. It's one of those things where like
I mean,
when I try to put you in a box, I think there's a danger.
well, I love Arthurian legend. I love Saint Francis, and I love Dante. So
I definitely wouldn't question that. I didn't expect you to question that part. It's more like his attempt to dismiss the Renaissance, which I think most people see as like important and majestic.
yeah,
You
but
know what I'm saying?
I think he gives some examples of the Renaissance that he's less enamored of. Like, doesn't he mention Petrarch and his sonnets, which are
maybe.
maybe of lesser importance than Dante's Divine Comedy, but that's just a question of taste, I
But
suppose.
if we talk about the instincts that brought the Renaissance to fruition, they were like pretty healthy, right? They were about, again, embracing the body and like rejecting the severity of the Middle Ages,
Yeah,
things that I think you and I were excited about and were relieved
right. Yeah, and
that
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 in that
period in
sense,
history existed.
yeah, in that sense, I agree with you. And he contradicts
Okay.
himself because
Uh,
Da Vinci, Da Vinci is a Renaissance figure too, right? And he's specifically mentioned as one of those who revived that Greek ideal of the love of the older man for the younger man, right? That wouldn't have happened without the Renaissance. So
right, but that's when he's like appropriating that Platonic, yeah, line of argument for it to defend his actions. Whereas
yeah,
now we're seeing this like double back. Can you please read this and just give us a bit of your classicist response?
we hear the Gospels read far too often and far too badly, and all repetition is anti spiritual. I have an issue with that too. When one returns to the Greek, it is like going into a garden of lilies out of some narrow and dark house. Strange punctuation here. And to me, the pleasure is doubled by the reflection that it is extremely probable that we have the actual terms, the ipsissima verba used by Christ. It was always supposed that Christ talked in Aramaic. Even Renan thought so. But now we know that the Galilean peasants, like the Irish peasants of our own day, were bilingual, and that Greek was the ordinary language of intercourse all over Palestine. So what he's saying is that, contrary to what some believed, you know, the language, the Koine Greek of the New Testament is like colloquial. It's not a translation of Aramaic sermons, but
And it's
rather
Jesus' words. It's Jesus' words.
that's what he's saying. The ipsissimo, where as a citizen of the eastern portion of the Roman Empire at that time, yeah, he did speak Koine Greek, the common Greek. It's kind of like a basic English, of today. So that's part. At the crucifixion, he said, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which is thought to be Aramaic.
Okay. And I guess the only thing I would add to that is that I feel like a figure like Wilde, who wants to be progressive and is a gay man, is flamboyant, if he's going to take Christianity, he's got to flip it in a way that makes it sexy, right? So he's like, first of all, he's like, check it out. I can do it through a Greek lens, or I can do it through the lens of romanticism. I can find ways to spin Christ into like something sexy and enticing. And I think that's kind of funny just as a reflection of Wilde himself.
I'm more struck. I was more struck and perhaps troubled or annoyed by. Can you go back to the previous slide?
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
To
the first section.
No, the previous. Yeah,
this
here we go.
Well, you said you didn't like the repetition.
Yeah,
section.
All repetition is anti-spiritual. I say, on the contrary, that repetition variation is one of the hallmarks of, I don't know if I'll say all great art, but as a songwriter, that's an important structural device, right? The chorus is repetitive. There could be variation. There is always variation in the repetition, but it's the repetition that is an important aesthetic element in so many things that I personally produce. Even if we're talking about like quotation or appropriation or parody, you're always repeating something with a little twist to it. So is that anti-spiritual? I don't think so. I think I think that's like,
I think you're right. Yeah.
I think that's something that creates, it's an aesthetic device that creates more depth in a work of art, because
Yeah, I
it's
think
like
it's just
adding
Wilde.
another layer.
It's just for effect. I think it's just like a rhetorical flourish. Essentially, He's like, and his point is that we don't read the gospel with fresh eyes because of how banal it's become, and maybe because of the places it's read.
Well, I
These
think
like
it's
high pedestals and
and he's also, in general, condemning this lack of originality in people, right? Most people are other people.
Yeah.
So it's just this repetition of the pieties of society and proper thought and modes of conduct that he's attacking or railing against, perhaps. But, repetition in itself, think of like a chant. Okay, think of a mantra, which is repeated,
sure.
right?
That's what I thought about initially.
There you go.
When you
So is that
this.
anti-spiritual? I think it can lead you to a deeper state of consciousness, right? It's the repetition that allows you to, or just chanting the Om, for example, Om, over and over, right? It takes you to a...
Yeah, and again, but I think we should focus more on how that is referencing the Gospels. because I agree that that sentiment cannot stand. It can't hold water. It's too easy to poke holes through. I agree with you.
Okay.
But I'm saying
Then
if
let's
we
move
limit
on.
it to the Gospels, okay. Just he continues here to say, so now it's interesting because we've seen Greek gods and Christ like juxtaposed, and now they're kind of married, with him being excited at the fact that Socrates and Plato might have been able to communicate directly with Jesus because of their mutual Greek. So just again, he wants to see Jesus in that throne of just intellectuals. Viewers, I think, will get more out of this slide than listeners, but we'll ignore the image on the right. And just thought this was funny, just the way he's talking to Boosey, saying that, like, love is a sacrament that should be taken kneeling, and Domine non sum dignus should be on the lips and in the hearts of those who receive it. What does that mean? Do you know? Domine non sum dignus?
Lord, I am unworthy.
Yeah. And then he says, I wish you would sometimes think of that. You need it so much. It's just like, it's just a funny way to talk to him.
Here's repetition again. This is a Catholic prayer, Domine non sum dignus. This is what the Scobie character in Graham Greene's The Heart of the Matter finds himself praying, right? When he converts to Catholicism. So,
and I just think in this very small space, you get the arrogance and the quasi-humility, right? Within, like, I mean, it's one thing to contradict yourself, like, over a course of 4 or 5 pages, but, like, when the tension is so closely compacted,
yeah.
It's pretty funny. So here again, he's continuing to make this argument about Christ as the romantic. He says he was the first person who ever said to people that they should live flower-like lives.
I like that.
And he took children as the type of what people should try to become. So I guess these are two, like, massive romantic tropes. And yeah, here he just goes on to say that Christ, what he liked about Christ is that he wasn't focused on material things, that his morality is all sympathy, just what morality should be. It just makes really strong statements that, again, I feel like is perfect for an Oscar Wilde gay man. I'm sorry to, like, paint it through that lens, but that's just how I see it. Like if the only thing that he had ever said had been her sins are forgiven her because she loved much, it would have been worthwhile dying to have said it. Like that. It's like this is kind of like really strong, sexy statements. His justice is all poetical justice, exactly what justice should be. Okay, got a nice, and then again, it's like making the Christ story sexy. So ignoring the picture, talking about Mary Magdalene, he says that through her example of breaking the rich vase of alabaster and putting the expensive oils and spices on Jesus' feet, like, Christ is saying that every moment should be beautiful, that the soul should always be ready for the coming of the bridegroom, always waiting for the voice of the lover. My reading of that was really rushed and primitive. Do you want to add anything, or just keep going?
I'm just fixated on the picture, so keep going.
That was the tamest of that series. So yeah, again, more commentary on Jesus and his kind of more progressive morality. He talks about he regarded sin and suffering as being in themselves beautiful, holy things and modes of perfection. It seems a very dangerous idea. It is. All great ideas are dangerous.
That's a good line.
His primary desire was not to reform people, any more than his primary desire was to relieve suffering. To turn an interesting thief into a tedious honest man was not his aim. That's a really cool line, too.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. I don't know. I wonder how many theologians are taking this kind of angle on Jesus. And this is interesting, too. Of course, the sinner must repent, but why? Simply because otherwise he would be unable to realize what he had done. So again, that word realize, if we came back to whatever it is, like it's about the realization that's important.
Mm-hmm.
And the sin is not the problem. The sin is good because it helps you realize. We've got it. We've made it to the final slide. And it's no longer related to the Christ narrative. But I find myself watching Piers Morgan videos too often for my own good.
Hate watching.
Recently. And I guess, or yeah, and he gets good guests, but I still think basically he's a dick. So for what he was aiming at was popularity. I'm trying to remember who he's talking about here.
Boosey's father.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so for what he was aiming at was popularity, and to pose as a champion of purity is, in the present condition of the British public, the surest mode of becoming for the nonce a heroic figure. I like the word nonce, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's, I don't know, because you get quote unquote woke people as being champions of purity, but you also get the people who are outraged by the woke mob. They are in their own ways champions of purity. If they are like offended by some kind of flamboyancy or gay representation, or you know what I'm saying? So it can go both ways.
Of course, they're all heroes in their own narratives. They're all
yes
the ones that are the champions, however they choose to describe it, right? So
right, exactly. So
they're equally revolting.
Any final words? We've made it through.
Well, again,
many
I'm
slides.
glad you chose this because it inspired me to go back and clean up the draft of Wilde's Day, and I have like a month off now, and I will finish editing the text with contributions from my co-author, and I'm going to try to get the book out before summer. So I think that's very much something listeners can hopefully look forward to. Although I think you have a copy of my most recent work and I haven't heard anything about it, so I'm assuming you discarded it.
Remind me, please.
Please, what? Remind you of what?
What is the most recent text?
Pilgrimizing.
Okay. Yeah. I got a good start and I was loving it. I don't know how I got sidetracked. I will complete it. No, it was very good. I was enjoying.
How far along did you get?
Maybe 30 pages.
Okay. Well, that's fine.
Yeah, we can discuss. You should choose it as a text, and I will have no excuse.
Well, I don't know about that. Anyway, okay. I hadn't
my
heard
parting
anything,
words
so...
about this text.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to say a couple parting words, and then you can tell us a little bit about the next text. So, which I know you've already previewed, but I need a reminder. So I want to first of all say that your bookstore often has texts that you probably don't realize can blow your mind. So always be excited when you go to a bookstore. And I'm very grateful to have seen this side of Oscar Wilde because, and it again just shows me like how little I know. You have that cliche of the more you know, the less you know. For me, it would just be like the older I get, the more I realize like how much exists in the literary landscape that I'm just completely ignorant of, and which is good stuff and exciting stuff. So, which makes me excited because it means that there's a lot more revelations to be had in my reading of texts. So, what do we have coming up next?
Well, next is Amiri Baraka's Somebody Blew Up America.
That's right.
Yeah. And
cool.
You are familiar with it, I realized when I was editing the last episode, because you alluded to who. I didn't catch that.
I read it.
Yeah.
In my undergrad.
Well, okay. Well, so you've read it on the page. Have you seen the spoken word performance with saxophone?
No, but I think I've heard it recited as well. Like I had a little phase there where I was very impressed.
I'll send you the video that I have in mind, because his delivery of it, his performance of it really adds like another layer to the text. So yeah,
sure.
That'll be the next topic, and hopefully we can discuss it within an hour or 90 minutes at the most.
I knew that I could get you to do more than an hour and a half if I was stubborn about it.
Well,
so
you did.
I think I did well.
You seduced me like Boosey seduced Wilde. It's your fault.
Exactly.
All right,
listeners, if you made it this far, you deserve an award as well. You're going
straight to heaven, as Robbie Ross did after he raised his hat to Wilde.
Yeah,
as he was being escorted to prison. I can't believe we didn't mention that. So much more we could have talked about, but read the text for yourself and send us your comments about it. There it is.
Thanks for listening, everybody.